Good evening, everybody. Welcome to episode 5 of the Black Male Studies Sessions with Dr. Tommy J. Curry. My name is Torraine Walker. I am a writer, I am a journalist, I am a digital content creator. This series is sponsored by the African American Men's Historical Society. The AMHIS is a Black American Men's Intellectual Society focused on the preservation, history, and empowerment of Black men. Go to amhis.org to learn more and visit their Substack at amhis.substack.com. Earlier this year, a young man at Delta State University in Mississippi named Trey Reed was found hanging from a tree near a pickleball court by a group of DSU football players. Um, he was a freshman who had only just started college, and Reed's death immediately sparked rumors of a potential lynching, owing to the Mississippi's history of racist lynching and the long history of brutality against Black men. This particular death is one of a string of lynchings or hangings of young Black men in the very recent history of Mississippi. There have been, including Trey Reed, 9 different young Black men who have been found hanging from trees in the state of Mississippi since 2000. But this isn't confined to the South. There have been Black men found hanging in California and recently in Texas and also in Manhattan. This recent as 5 years ago. And this particular situation has a lot of historical connotations that most of us in this room already know. But I personally think it speaks to the history of dehumanization of Black male bodies from the Middle Passage to the present day. And to unpack this conversation and to unpack this particular phenomenon, I, of course, wanted to have another conversation with Professor Tommy J. Curry. Professor Tommy J. Curry's PhD, MPH, Personal Chair of Africana Philosophy and Black Male Studies, Department of Philosophy at the University of Edinburgh School of Philosophy, Psychology, and Language Sciences. He is the editor of Black Male Studies, a series exploring the paradoxes of racially subjugated males, the editor of Decolonial Philosophy and Philosophy Compass, and most of you know him as the author of The Man Not, Race, Class, Genre, and the Dilemmas of Black Manhood, the winner of the 2018 American Book Award. Dr. Curry, how are you doing tonight?
I'm doing well, sir. I'm doing well. How are you?
I'm well. I'm well. Thank you for taking time out of your schedule to have this conversation. It's always a pleasure to be able to chop it up with you on these subjects. Um,
No, man, it's a
so
pleasure.
let so let's get into it. You said that this young man's tragic death is a harbinger of things that have connotations going all the way back to the beginning of this country when it comes to Black men and Black male bodies. Can you
Yes.
talk a little bit about what you mean by that and how that streaks back?
Yeah. Let me just say that this news hit me a little hard. I mean, for over a month, I've really been thinking about Mr. Reed's death because back in the late '90s, the first year I went off to college, a black man was lynched not too far from my hometown of Lake Charles in Jasper, Texas. Um, James Byrd was walking home from a party. 3 white men tied his ankles to the back of a truck and dragged this black man until his limbs were falling off. Um, the 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 imagery of black men being killed and dismembered does not truly convey the kind of horror and anger that happens to southern poor black people when they see another lynching. And I remember it so clearly, the death of Mr. Byrd, because I had just come back from college and literally 2 weeks, it was in June or July, I think it was in June. Um, and we heard about this brother being dragged so his hands and part of his neck was torn off. And ever since I was in the university and been in the university, I've been haunted by the kind of violence that black men and boys suffer. When we look, it's not just when we go back to the Middle Passage, because what what often happens, and I feel that I'm becoming more and more impatient about this tendency. In the academy, we have scholars who try to disown or reappropriate the violence that black men have experienced as a general racial phenomenon. So they will use literary criticism, psychoanalysis, etc., to dissipate the horrors of castration, the disproportionality of lynchings, and even police killings, right? We saw this with Crenshaw say her name. It doesn't just bring attention to the suffering of our sisters, which we, and I think at this point, there's not very many academics that deny that black women suffered from various crimes like lynching, etc. But what it does do is it takes away the disproportionality of black men being targeted by systems of lynching, castration, etc. So when you look on the slave ship, for instance, right, and you think about the barrier, the Barricado between the black men who were chained to each other, the women and children who were behind a barricado or a wooden plank that white people could also take refuge around if black men tried to revolt. You see, the slave system had already identified before we ever got to the New World that black men were physical threats capable of revolt. We saw this again in 1791 with the Haitian Revolution and the question of whether or not the freedom that black men tried to create in the Republic of Haiti was akin to the demons rising from below to doom Western civilization. And in every century, the 18th, the 19th, the 20th, and now in the 21st, black men are being sacrificed as symbols of white supremacy's triumph over the black race. And it's not just an argument about racism. You know, I always think back. I used to teach AJ William Myers' book Destructive Impulses, right? And he has this great line in there where he says that white men and women were able to destroy black men because he was basically a nigger on the loose and they were trying to control a beast with a cloven hoof, right? And I remember talking to my students about the imagery of black men for 400 or 500 years, right? That there's a cosmology where black men are demons, demonic spirits, right? And we see this in the work of someone like Dr. Ronald Neal. So we're not dealing with a measurable hatred. We're dealing with a fundamental view among white America that black men's presence has to be eliminated. And you see this back in the 70s with the work of James Stewart. You've seen this in the work of Jim Sedanius. You've seen this in the work of Anthony LaMelle Jr. You've seen this in my work. And despite all the suffering that we see in America right now, despite all the histories we want to excavate, there has not been a reckoning with the continued death of black men and boys. After Colin Kaepernick paid for this autopsy, there was no national outrage, right? We're still talking about Trump. We're still talking about what's being lost. We see our own people suffering, and we've made no connection between the deaths of black men and boys that we've witnessed for a decade. Think about this: black children spitting up blood on American streets because they've been shot by white cops. We've seen no awakening in the consciousness of black Americans about what's really at stake when we're talking about white supremacy and racism. We are past the intersectional ideas of discrimination. We are past debates about recognition. We are now in a world where segregation, where gerrymandering, where white vigilantism, and the continued lynching of black men sends a signal to the world that America is still a white republic. And we have no answers for that. We have a crime, a horror that's haunted the United States for decades, where black men have been over 95% of the victims of lynching since the 1870s. And despite that, when it happens yet again in the 21st century, where we swear to ourselves that we've made racial progress, we've had no analysis that even attempts to ask the question, why are black male deaths so required for America to rule over black people? There hasn't been one theoretical venture, one political movement, one pundit on national TV to ask, what is the need for this repetition of black men and boys to be sacrificed to America's greed and its tyranny so that the society somehow can operate normally? And that failure is going to get more and more of our people killed. You know, Tori, it's difficult to sit back and, I'm in Scotland, right? And it is very difficult for me to see what's going on in the United States and then see people still launch identity politics against the wave of white supremacy. I see people defining themselves outside of blackness consistently, as if the old tricks that appeal to their liberal masters somehow will operate and work now that you have new conservative overseers. And the dullness, the inability to comprehend the moment that we're in, when you see black male bodies hanging from trees, is astounding to me. Racism targets men and boys first, but its intent is to oppress and eliminate the rest of the group. We've been over this. We've seen it in military science. We've seen it in genocide. So we see it even in the work that Dr. Gilmore is doing up in Toronto in counterinsurgency. This is an established pattern of human conflict. But because we have people that are so married to systems of coalitions and hopes, and may I say, dependency on white liberal recognition, we don't have the ability to respond to what's actually happening to our people and in our communities. And I think that the worst hasn't even shown up yet.
I want to ask you about that because what's happening now almost seems like a throwback to the old horrors that happened in the end at the end of the Civil War, at the end of Reconstruction when federal troops were pulled out of the South, up until the 1920s
Hmm.
to the modern day, almost to the 1960s rather. And it seems like
Yeah.
what's happening, if you look at the patterns, ties right into some of the things that happened in the bad old days when lynching was a very commonplace thing. You would see a dead body, black male body hanging from a tree. If it wasn't sort of like a local festival where people would come out and celebrate his death, it would just be a body hanging from a tree. There was very little investigation done by the law enforcement at that time, and 9 times out of 10, it was either swept under the rug, it was never investigated other than pulling the body down and burying it, or what you see
Hmm.
like in the present day now, where I'm looking at the data right now from Mississippi. The young black men that I talked about who were found hanging from trees in Mississippi, and this is all in Mississippi so far. 8 black male bodies from the year 2000 up until 2025 with this young man, Mr. Reed. Every last
Yeah.
one has been judged a suicide by the coroners in the state in the counties that they were found in. That sounds
Hmm.
very much like a throwback to, well, he slipped on a bar of soap or he died trying to escape, of some of the old cliches that you see when it comes to the deaths of black men. Do you think that these cliches are coming back because the country is reverting back to an old system of white supremacy or just in a different form?
But listen, I'll be honest with you, brother. I don't think they ever went away in the South. That's much of my perspective about race relations and about white violence come from the fact that I was born at the end of segregation. So for Southern black people, there was always the horror. There's always the threat that you can be killed or castrated if you talk to a white woman or you were out of pocket with a white man. So I think that we see the increased symbolism of what this means to white America. So I think when you see someone like a Mr. Trey Reed, and it happens when you're at kind of the apex of white violence in America, where white people are saying that black civil rights leaders before Charlie Kirk was shot, where he was making statements that the civil rights movement was a mistake. When Project 2025 is saying that, the idea of equality is a mistake. When you have white supremacists saying that they have a right to own America and that it's a white republic. I think when you have that language and you have the intent in white Americans now saying that there was a mistake for letting black people even pretend that they should be equal to white people, then that lynching, right? That lynching of Mr. Reed means something different because you can't depend on the moral conscience of white people or liberal white people to now say that those other white people are fundamentally wrong. Because now that conservative whites have power, there is no liberal entertainment that's trying to push back on white violence. They're not risking their necks for black people. And this is why I said the difference now is that we don't have black solidarity, black racial consciousness, whatever term you would like to use, that's offended that black men are still being hung from trees. We have black people in black studies and in black universities that hate black men just as much as white people do. We have classes in these courses saying that black men are dangerous, rapists, deviants, criminals. You pick your poison. So you can't dehumanize a population within your own group and then expect people to come together because they're offended that their lives were taken. Even now, we don't have a conversation about these young black men and boys being innocent, having potential, being a loss to the potential of our race. So none of those conversations have even been had. And the crazy thing is, I saw on Instagram that there were some pictures from the Kimberly Crenshaw's AAPF, and it was talking about the mobilization of misogyny and misogynoir by the Trump administration along with racism. I didn't see any mention or focus on this lynching. See, we're being distracted by a kind of language that was meant to mobilize black middle class people into white institutions and political programs, and we're not attending to the violence that's happening in southern states, throughout the Midwest, and in various black communities where white people are taking over, where white people are marching into HBCUs under the guise of free speech to tell black people that they're inferior. Where you have white people now saying that because black people are not going to be in institutions, they should be controlled and a managed population. This isn't just fascism. That's it's fascism, as I've said before, because white people are affected. We are seeing the deliberate cultural shift where black people are now thought to be a managed population that do not have the freedom and need to be prevented from resisting an uprising against the white majority. So when we see this happen, I don't know if it's reverting back. I think that it's an amplification of the tendencies that's been there. And I want to be really clear about this. For the last 30 or 40 years, black scholars, black activists, black pundits, any black person that believed that racism was fundamentally there and was built off violence was silenced and not hired. This idea that black people are slaves and always will be slaves from Afro pessimism is the most polite version of what we've discussed in southern states literally since I was a child. Because you can say that black people are permanently oppressed or black people are forever the slave, but that's not the threat. The threat is when black people believe that they should be free and should be better than the condition that white people try to hold them in. And in Louisiana, where you have deacons and where you had Huey P. Newton and you have a history of resistance, even by guns if necessary, that is a fundamentally different kind of thought. It's a different way of thinking about your relationship to your dominant oppressor. But we don't have conversations about that right now. We're constantly miseducated to believe that a political system or voting is going to remedy a problem that's built in the psyches of white people and what they think about black people. This country has never existed in a world where democratic freedom did not include the lynching and murder of black people, especially black men and boys, without abatement. It did not arrest, it never stopped. And we have to pretend that somehow we've made progress in this country. And in doing so, we've erased the fact that black people and black men are still dying and hanging from trees. So until we get our heads on straight and understand that our fate is tied together, black men, women, and children, black families and communities against the white population that's trying to spell our doom, we are not going to be able to respond to this moment. And unfortunately, given what Trump's already done in less than a year, we don't even have the kinds of protections that were built up for us in the 60s and 70s to allow us to respond to this moment. So we are put in a position where black male death is highly visible and there are no moral consciences that are willing to listen or recognize what those deaths mean. So the only available option we have is to turn to ourselves to actually start understanding why black men consistently die and why that thirst among the white population seems to only be quenched when it sees the corpse of a black man hanging from a tree.
Well, let's explore that a little bit more because my question is, what is it about the black male specifically and the black male body specifically that makes the black male take the brunt of racial animosity in this country?
Man, there's lots of theories, man. I mean, Sedanius, he was an evolutionary psychologist, so he thought that, all human conflict is basically a male on male battle. It's a war for men, man against man. And there's lots of strong evidence for that. I mean, you have other brothers who think that, it's psychological, that's an issue of the fear that black men inspire in white men. I mean, black male studies scholars kind of have, we have different opinions about this. My view is that, when you create societal hierarchies, they're going to focus on men because there's both competition for cultural reproduction and biological reproduction. But black men are largely unassimilatable within Western democratic societies. So the reasons, there's lots of different theories for why it happens, but the reality is that we haven't dedicated the resources to try to understand it. I mean, you have to think about this. We see that. I mean, historically, there were like 4,000 lynchings, and out of that, only 100 and less than 200 were black women. So that means that in the history of the United States, right, the majority of lynchings have overwhelmingly been men, and nobody has understood why. We won't even ask the question to dedicate the intellectual, much less the financial resources, to understand why black men seem to always be targeted by white supremacist societies. And this is what black male studies scholars have been attending to. Right? People like Sedanius and Felicia Prado say that patriarchy operates differently. That black men experience arbitrary set discrimination because that's what makes the subordinate male target hypothesis operate. That means that when you define an outgroup, you're going to define that outgroup, say it's terrorists. You're going to attack the men of that group. But what black male studies scholars are trying to say is like, yeah, but there's a highly sexualized component because you're not just killing black men. It's a ritual. It's a symbol. You're castrating them. You're sexually assaulting them. So patriarchy operates to target these men as well. So it's something beyond racism. And what we see in the Trump administration, and there was I wish I could remember the exact program, but in the Trump administration, there was this claim that they wanted to deport Mexican Latino men, but they want to keep the Latino women so they could reproduce with them. I think it was someone in California broadcasting this. And that speaks to this dynamic that when you're trying to control a population, you have to get rid of the people that are going to resist. You have to get rid of the people that are not going to assimilate. You have to get rid of the people that you cannot manage through soft power. And what we keep doing time and time again, despite seeing this play out in different scenarios across the world, is we ignore that fact. So when violence against black men happen or against black boys happen, you have some of our own people, some of our best and brightest minds in the academy, some of our best and brightest minds that are journalists and pundits, actually not saying anything about that because they can't themselves recognize the humanity of innocent black men and boys. So black men and boys are targeted without any kind of reproach to the humanity of them that's lost. And this is the way that white supremacist patriarchal societies operate. So we keep publishing lies. We keep reading the color purple, but we dare not look out into our own society and try to figure out why is it that the death of black men always signals more political and racial repression for the group they belong to.
There was a study done in 2017 about the intergenerational transmission of memory and trauma. The study
Yes.
was based in having interviews in the therapy sessions from Holocaust survivors and post-Holocaust representatives. And what was found in that study was even if you did not directly were a victim of the Holocaust, if you were not in the death camps, if you were not victimized by the Third Reich, the descendants of people who were in camps faced trauma, whether it was anxiety, insecurity,
Hmm.
and there was a host of mental issues that some people who were the grandchildren of these people dealt with. If that's true for Holocaust survivors, it has to be extremely true for the survivors of chattel slavery in America. And I'd like to know, what do you think about the fear instilled by the extrajudicial killing of black men and how that affects the mental state of black Americans in the present day and how we navigate our everyday lives?
Yeah, first off, I think the research on that is absolutely true. I think the epigenetic research that shows the transgenerational inheritance or transmission of trauma is absolutely correct. And we've seen actually when I was doing my master's in public health, I wrote several papers, several many articles on the effects of even police shootings on black communities. So in communities where black men were shot or black people were shot, you had higher rates of anxiety, stress, allostatic load, cardiac issues, high blood pressure, right? Sleep deprivation. This is all true, right? The problem is we don't have a way to diffuse the environment, right? Like we are there are two things happening. We have black men being taken out of environments and communities and being killed in the most gruesome way possible, right? The way they kill black men in this country, you don't see any other group of people murdered in that way, right? We don't see pictures of white children laying dead on pavements, spitting up blood, or calling for their families. We don't see that, but we see that when it comes to black men, right? We've seen those images of Trayvon Martin. We've seen those images of Mike Brown. So what that does is by identification with the victim, the black community is pulled into that horror. It is, as I said in The Man Not, this is a way to discipline black people so that you know that you too can be a victim of that kind of violence if you don't stay in line. And I have a very hard time believing that the people that we put in charge of discussing and studying these issues have accidentally, for the last 40 years, just not thought hard enough about what it means to see all these poor working class black men killed in the streets of America by vigilantes and by police. So there's a real public health issue here because the mental stability, the mental optimality, the prevention of weathering, right, us not being like geriatrically affected by the kinds of trauma and violence that we see. These are real conversations that we have to have as a community. But we've been locked again into a political system where the only thing we care about is politics and political representation on the Democratic platform. We don't have social workers or public health, scholars and clinicians going into communities to try to address or at least alleviate some of the symptoms of this kind of traumatic violence. It's not even a conversation. So it becomes very difficult for us to deal with that imagery. I mean, look, when you look at young black boys, I mean, like some of the research I'm doing now for my next book, when you look at young black boys and suicide ideation, it is directly tied to the internalization of negative stereotypes about black men. So when young black boys see black men killed, when young black boys see black men incarcerated, when young black boys hear the kind of negative stereotypes about black men as being worthless or trash or body bags that we see from some professors at Ivy League institutions on Twitter, when young black boys see that, it decreases their own self-worth. It creates negative thinking and a negative self-ideation model. And that spurs things like depression, anxiety, and suicide ideation. So we live in a society that's not only attacking black people, but specifically attacking black boys. And we don't have a response to that trauma because we're not studying that trauma. There are very few clinicians that have any idea about anti-black misandry, much less willing to acknowledge that it exists, despite all the data we have on racial battle fatigue, on negative self-conception, and we know empirically that suicide ideation among young black boys is the highest. They're among the highest demographic and have the highest incidences even attempted suicide. So we are a people floundering in a social political world that have people that give you lots of thoughts. We have lots of pundits, but we don't have lots of people with the specialties that can actually alleviate the health crisis, the mental health crises that we're experiencing as a people because of white supremacy and racism. And we can't even speak about the vigilante violence because we're not even organized anymore to even address what happens when racist whites come into our communities because we don't have the lawyers that are defending them in a world where we actually have white lawyers and white politicians saying that it's okay for white people to practice free speech, right? Their term, and harass black people, right? This is it's 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 almost laughable that you can have a group of people fight from slavery, fight through Jim Crow, fight for civil rights. All the time we're losing people. None of this is peaceful for us. We're not white feminists. We didn't just march and then say we demand rights and they write us into a bill. Our people died. Our men died, our women died. Families lost fathers and mothers and children, right? Because they believed in the idea of freedom. And you're telling me that in less than 40 years, we forget what all that violence is. You're telling me in 40 years, we will tolerate white supremacists telling us that our leaders are somehow bad because Martin Luther King had orgies or cheated on his wife. Like it's unbelievable to me that we live in a world where we can see black people being killed by white people and nothing in us immediately jumps to defend the humanity of the black people who are victimized by the people who have historically oppressed us and enslaved us for centuries. And we think somehow we're being intellectual when we disassociate ourselves from the reality of that violence. That's disgraceful because there's not. I can tell you by living in Europe, there's not a single white group, be they Polish, be they French, be it British or British. There's not a single group of people that do not wear their ethnic group on their arm. There's not a single one. So they'll speak greatly and possibly about Europe, but they will invest all their energy in developing Italy or Poland or Britain. So now you take that mind that right some of the most prosperous nations in the world are ethnocentric, are ethno nationalists in fact. But then you go back to America and you can't even get black people across class divisions to value the lives of each other. You have Europeans willing to go to war with other Europeans if they cross the wrong border without if they don't have a treaty in place in the EU. But you can't even get black Americans when they're being killed by their oppressor. The same group of people that enslaved them, the same group of people that wanted Jim Crow segregationism, the same group of people that in majority voted for Donald Trump where he said, this is what I'm going to do. You can't even get black people to become solidified and unified against that immediate threat. So there is no response beyond trying to re-educate black people, but at the same time you're trying to re-educate and re-socialize and bring black people together, you have the same other groups of black people saying we don't need to do that. So the only predictable consequence of that is going to be the loss of more black life. And it's upsetting and it's nonsensical because we're so removed from reality. We've retreated to the recesses of middle classdom that we don't want to understand what violence actually looks like in our society. And that's the tragedy. The tragedy is us not recognizing that when we watch for a decade all these young boys be slaughtered in the street, what was coming. That we could look at someone like Mr. Reed hung from a tree in Mississippi and nobody starts a protest or much less says anything because we're so repressed by the system, right? That we're willing to accept that loss. And that attitude, that apathy, that indifference towards Black Death, where it's not spectacular anymore, it's not aberrational or boring. That's what's going to lead us into crisis because it means that the only way we think we're going to get out of this is to yet again appeal to white liberals who at the moment have nothing to say to us, right? And it's a disgrace to what we think black politics actually is and should be.
Do you think that modern day black people in America are possibly avoiding this issue because if we had to face that issue, then we would have to see a sea change in the way we move politically and what we think about
Absolutely.
as defense. Because if you look at the history, as you said, even though we're dealing with this in the modern day, it was far worse in the 1920s up through the 1950s and 60s. And even in the midst of all that, there were black men and black women who said that we need to defend ourselves. And there were organizations
Absolutely.
formed, whether it was the Black Panthers or the Deacons for Defense and other groups that may have been smaller, didn't have that much notoriety. So, what's the difference between then and now that we won't even think about those alternatives?
But black people don't love each other anymore, right? We've been socialized to believe that the greatest threats to black people are other black people, and we fundamentally believe that. You can pick up any Black Studies journal, right, and you will find that argument. You see, and this is the problem. The problem is that when white liberals made the pact of Title VII and start saying we'll redistribute goods like jobs, capital, affirmative action, access to institutions, right? They picked who they wanted. They wanted the few black men who were going to be liberals and disown black radicalism. So you saw this in the Harvard Project back in the day with Skip Gates focusing on literary criticism rather than sociology, history, etc. Right, saying that they were the true nationalists because they were the ones that made it and became ultra successful capitalists. Right, um, and and you see, of course, as we talked about before, with intersectionality and black feminism. Right. So what did it do? It's not just about those ideologies, right? It's not just picking on those ideologies. It's a question of the class status that it afforded people within structure, right? So black feminism became a way for us to say black nationalism, black revolutionary ideas, black violence, right? Black militant resistance is fundamentally bad. It's not to be trusted. It's patriarchal, right? Even though these men, and this is what Sylvia Wynter says, right? That even that you had these black feminists saying that you shouldn't trust these working class black men, but you had black women in the organization and you had black men dying to protect black women and their families, right? This is the testimony of even black women who were part of the New Republic of Africa, right? So you got a middle class version of radicalism that was built on coalitions and dependency, right? So that meant that no longer are we going to be able to talk about militant black resistance or even black communities led by women, right, who fundamentally defended black men and boys given this kind of targeting that they've experienced historically, because now that's patriarchal, right? And you have this other issue where you have leading black male scholars and political figures, right? And you put Jesse Jackson in this just as well, right? Where you now have this kind of diffusion of black rage that's upset about oppression, that says that we're going to embrace the gradualism and over time things will come, things will change. And, Brother Jackson is at the end of his life. He's an old man now. And the same things he said at the beginning of his career that he fought for are now coming back to haunt him. So when he dies, he will die in an America that has less freedom, less rights, less protections for black people than when he was marching in the streets for them in '67. So, no, people are not going to approach this issue because it threatens their pockets. And no, black people in the academy, right, who we usually end up having these arguments with in social media and even in commentary, because now, public commentary and punditry and journalism is just a reflection of the conversations that go on in the university, unfortunately, right? These people don't see themselves reflected in working class black people. You see, the real difference is you have black male studies scholars that are willing to talk about this issue and talk about the deaths of black men and boys because they're from working class communities. Every single one of the black male studies scholars that I've trained, right, come from poverty, come from their first generations. And these are people that academies and universities, research one university said don't belong here because overwhelmingly the black people that are in the academy are middle class. I'm first generation. I come from Southern poverty. So the sensibility of what we're discussing when we talk about the hatred of racism isn't simply based on us disagreeing or not getting a job. We're talking about people who are poor, where if they disappear, nobody cares. We're talking about the brother in the family, like Mr. Trey Reed, who was killed, where Colin Kaepernick had to come in and pay for the autopsy because the family couldn't afford it. You see, those people, those working class black people that receive the brunt of white horror, terrorism, and indifference and violence, those people are not reflected in the minds of middle class black people. That's why they're never the focus of position papers. That's why they're never the focus of marches. That's why nobody really cares. And you can go on TV and argue about who's getting more goddamn news coverage because of the number of black people. You don't think that your group is getting covered enough for dying. Right? This is the problem that's been created by us becoming passive to what we think we deserve. Instead of us arguing for full freedom, we've accepted a freedom where we just accept there's certain groups or certain numbers of black people have to die at the hands of white people. And because those are largely poor black men and boys, we've said that's a cost that we're willing to accept. We can write the check. Let's move into the academy. Let's move into political office. Let's say that we've made progress. Right. And this is something that Derek Bell told me before he died. I never forget it. I actually still have the letter because I was gonna put it in my book. He said, Tommy, there's going to be hell to pay because of Obama. He's like, you know, there's going to be hell to pay for an America that has to see itself ruled by a black man when it still fundamentally believes in white supremacy and white power. And even though he's been gone for, God, I mean, almost I'm going on 2 decades now, that still rings true. So there have been black intellectuals that have been telling the truth. But even when they've told the truth, they've been pushed out of the fields that they created. Richie Delgado, Linda Green, Kenneth Nunn, Derek Bell, right? That's what the first generation of critical race theorists were saying. They weren't talking about coalitions and intersectionality because they didn't believe that law would deliver equality. But you replace that, right? You replace that by moving certain groups of critical race theorists into elite Ivy League universities, giving them big paychecks, making them world pundits and pushing their theories all around the world. And nobody can even question it. So if you say
Even
that
Francis,
certain groups
even
of
Francis Cress,
people,
even Francis Cress Welsing, she was considered a pariah for the with mainstream black studies
absolutely.
till she got close to death and everything. Now people, I hear a lot of her studies and a lot of the things she said being coming out of the mouths of people who were never even touching that.
Well, no, because but it's the same thing. They tried to assassinate her character. They said because she had, what, offensive and pathological views of same-sex couples, right? That none of her work should ever be read. But they don't say anything about Audre Lorde. They don't say anything about her abuse, her lies, her distrust, manipulation, her sexual coercion. That's what I'm saying. Like I'm tired of the fact we are our own worst enemy. We will say that someone's not a good person and then use that only when they're a male to disqualify them, or if they're not part of the liberal pack. Cress Welsing was an African centered scholar. She believed very seriously in the idea that the races were at war and that the violence and oppression that black people suffered could be predicted on the basis of both the psychological and cultural biological disposition of the white race. Right? Do I agree with that completely? No. Times have changed, theories have changed. I have the benefits of some science that she didn't have back then. But is the thesis, is the idea correct? Absolutely. Is she trying to explain a phenomenon that we're witnessing even today? Absolutely. So why does this person have to be censored from the annals of black intellectual thought? Right? But we welcome Audre Lorde, right? We welcome Bell Hooks, despite the egregious things she said. It's sickening how people have chairs in Heidegger studies, and he was a goddamn Nazi. So white people can find insights into the existential phenomenology of a Nazi, but we disown our own people if they don't have the right identity politic in the 70s and 80s of what we want to comport now. It's I we are a people trying to confront a problem. We are a people with very few resources, right? With very little power. So the idea that we can somehow wait this out and just take the losses, the sacrifices of these young black boys and these black families and these black women, right? Because as we just saw in the video with the black woman that was denied care when she was in labor for 30 minutes an hour, right? White woman's indifferent. Right, like the world is telling us what it thinks about our people, and we don't even. And at this point, we don't even have those inner resources to compensate for what the world's taking from us. And it's a sad thing to see, from the other side of the ocean, man.
I want to get into a little bit of what you talked about earlier. Some of the other aspects of lynching as we know it that have moved maybe from the physical into the psychological and the spiritual. And I want to talk about castration. In a way, it seems like physical castration of a black man's genitalia has moved into psychological castration sociopolitical and economic castration. A lot of American politics, they sell this idea that everybody can be inclusive to the point where intersectionality kind of feels like something that everybody can pick from. If you feel like you're an oppressed person, there's a place for you in the field of intersectionality or in the world of intersectionality where you can find a place to build on. But black men are even excluded from that. Even though the
Yeah.
data and the subs and the studies and all of the statistics say that we are still living at the bottom of every socioeconomic metric for the most part. But can you talk a little bit about that social, political, and economic exclusion that also ostracizes and castrates black men psychologically and the community at large?
I mean, absolutely, man. I mean, look, one of the last pieces that Richard Wright wrote was Man of All Work. And, James Baldwin mentions this, quite fondly because he says that he thinks that, this is what Wright got correct outside of his, kind of reveling in violence. And the point was very simple. The point was that as a black man in America, you will be excluded from basically every positive institution, be it education, work, and in some cases, religion. And Wright said the only way for a black man to get a job was basically to turn himself into a woman. And in the short story, he puts on a dress, disguises himself as a woman, and the only way he's able to work is to basically be a maid. And what ends up happening is, with him on with the dress on, the white man tries to rape him. The white husband that he's working in the house for tries to rape him. And the lesson that Wright's trying to explain here is that, and this is something that's actually taken up by Anthony Lamell Jr., right, a queer Afrocentric scholar. But he says that, look, the process of black men being ostracized, castrated, right, barred from participating in society, is a process of feminization. But the black man will never be seen as a woman or treated like a woman because he will always still be the rapist, right? And Baldwin has a really powerful piece in his nonfiction. I like his nonfiction much more than his fiction because we get to trace the arguments. But he just says, look, at any point that a white man decides that a black man is trying to act like a man and resist and assert himself as being a full fledged human being in the world, he'll cut his penis off. And he says that the way that you know that you arrive in the South is because the red clay of the South is stained with centuries of blood of black men hanging from trees with their penises cut off. We are not dealing with a new problem. We are not dealing with groups of black men that are trying to reclaim masculinity or whatever nonsense, black feminists say about black men. What we are dealing with is a condition of dehumanization where black men, and by effect, black people, are being regressed socially and economically to a position of being managed by a white majority population. And in doing so, it means that the imagery of wealth and progress will fade away. Because insofar as you decrease the wealth of black men, and this was the study that was done by Chetty and Hendren a long time ago, that the racial gap in wealth is pushed by the discrimination against black men and other groups of men in the job force. So it means that they are creating a structural barrier to black people as a whole from accumulating wealth and being able to mobilize up the social ladder. And I think that until we get our heads around what social castration, feminization, and what we call it phallicism in Black male studies, but what it means to institutionally decimate Black men out of education, economics, and the job market, we're not going to understand racial oppression. And that's really the issue, brother. We don't understand the system of oppression that's actually directed to us because we're offering theories that have no kind of relevance to the reality and the deaths we keep observing with our own two eyes.
Having said that, I want to move into something that you've spoken about before and something that I've observed when these conversations take place, or even in the way people move when we talk about black men. Um, I have a theory, and I'd love to get your thoughts on this. I think that everything you've said and this history of brutality and dehumanization of black men have basically created a situation where everyone in America, everyone in Western, not I won't say Western society, but mostly in America, has this idea that they've accepted this idea of the black boogeyman, which basically means that any black boy, any black man, no matter how big they are, no matter how slim they are, no matter what they look like, if you are black and you are male in American society, you are automatically perceived as a potential boogeyman. And the only way that you can be dealt with is either to be contained, controlled, or destroyed by the state or by the agents of the state. And this is what's interesting to me, and I'd love to get your thoughts on this. That mentality has permeated black society, black American society, to the point where anybody of any gender or ethnicity, even if you are black, can participate in that process. Do you think that's true or no?
No, I think that's true. I think all the evidence points to that. I mean, listen, the difference, I think the difference in having a theory versus having an explanatory framework or conceptual model is that we see lots and lots of evidence for the fact that black men have to be managed or have to be killed. And you know what I'm saying is, look, you could go all the way back to Robert Staples. You could go back to James Stewart's work. The dehumanization of a people happens through men first. That's just a fact. I don't. There's not even a contradicting theory that I know of that says anything different. So what we are seeing in America is that pattern, what Adam Jones called gendercide, what Earl Miller called male marginalization, what Sedanius calls subordinate male target hypothesis, what Black male studies scholars call anti-Black misandry or misandric aggression. This is what we're dealing with. It is just a fact. You have, for the last 40 years, you've had people try to explain it. And we don't have an answer to it because we keep disowning it. You see, recognizing this form of dehumanization, if we recognize that black men are monsters, right? If we recognize that that aspect of dehumanization means that they're always going to be targeted, always excluded, always murdered, dismembered, etc., then it changes the landscape of how we study racism. Because if we put the male target in the center, and then start saying, well, then why does violence reverberate through all these other institutions? Then a lot of the liberal politics that people have made their careers off of, a lot of the talking points that many people on television have, most of the stuff that white liberals are saying, like their arguments about diversity and inclusion, all that fades away because it shows that you made those pacts, you made those deals on the back of the deaths of black men and boys. And that's exactly what Elaine Brown says in her book, The Condemnation of Little B, is that they made a pact where they're going to incarcerate, kill, murder, and demonize working class black men so that they can dispel them from the civil rights idea. They can form basically economic or political pacts with liberal whites. Every piece of evidence we have, sociologically, economically, and even from the testimonies of ex Panther women, right? Kathleen Cleaver says the same thing, right? Tells us this is the case. But you'll never have the liberal institutions that support black thinkers admitted. And I think that's what we're up against. We're not just up against white supremacy. We're up against the active miseducation and political ideology of a group of black people that don't see the violence against poor black people as being the deal breakers for their pacts with liberal white America. And now that conservatives are in power, there's nothing to halt the brakes on the absolute demolition of black homes, communities, wealth, and even black lives. And that's just where we are right
All right. I want to move the conversation along, but while I'm doing that, I want to leave space for a brief Q&A with Dr. Curry. So if anybody in the audience has any questions for Dr. Curry, send your request in now. I won't take up too much of his time because he's in a different time zone. But if you have some questions and you want to ask some questions about what you've heard tonight, send me a request, put your hand up so I can see you, and I'll try to get you through. But while we're waiting for people to come through who want to speak or want to ask a question, I want to move into one more thing. Can you talk about how how lynching, which was basically seen as something that could be spur of the moment in the 1890s up until the 1920s, up until the 1950s, where it was a lot of it was either groups of angry white men and women who would basically form these lynch mobs, and some of that conversation, some of that behavior was offloaded into the state. Can you talk about how some of that power has been transferred from individuals and civilians into the state and its apparatus?
I mean, the state's always been involved one way or the other in lynchings, right? I mean, when you have sheriffs who are part of the KKK lynching people, right? Like they're still actors of the state. I think what you have today is a wholesale indifference towards black life by police, courts, etc. I mean, look, a month ago I spent a week, as part of a defense team for a black man that was being accused of murder. And when I tell you that that experience completely shifted the way that I view courts, the law, and even what black men are up against, I mean, it almost makes you feel hopeless. And I'm saying that because when we think of the state, we often describe the state as, these kind of paramilitary or violent entities like the police that are utilizing force to enforce the will of a white public that wants to see black people or black men and boys killed. But in this courtroom, I watched black judges control white prosecutors to eliminate practically all black men from a jury so that an all white jury of white women could convict a black man of murder when they had no evidence connecting him to the weapon or to the crime. And the only thing that happened was for them to try to use the intent that he was an abuser, which he had never been convicted of previously, and wanted to kill this black woman who also had a criminal history. The state has created an ideology that has socialized black people into believing that it is the best way for black people to remain safe. And if that means criminalizing poor black men, if it means killing poor black boys, if it means removing or impoverishing black families, the state controls the way that we think about the very condition of us living. And we haven't had that conversation. We haven't had the conversation of replacing fathers, families, neighborhoods, etc., with the idea that police officers or government officials or politicians will keep us safe more than the people in our own community. So yeah, I think the state has overextended itself, but we have not done a good job of policing those boundaries.
All right, Dr. Curry. I want to take some time to do a brief Q&A if you have a little bit of time to go through that.
Sure.
All right. So if you have a question for Dr. Curry, now's the time. Put your hand up. I'll try to get to you as soon as I can. If you have a question, make sure you ask Dr. Curry a question. If you have a statement, make your statement very brief. But for the most part, we're just asking questions. So get off what you want to say, and then we'll move on, and then we'll go to the next speaker. So first, we're going to start with, I think I see Dr. Gaskew in here, but let's go to community notes. You have the microphone. What's your question for Dr. Curry?
Uh, I was going to talk about. Well, I had a question about the economic portion of it and how it's. I guess the question would be, what would be the solution to the economic portion of it if it's all debt-based and credit-based systems? So if it's centralized control systems, which they ultimately make it plan systems. So if you're saying we can't move forward because they essentially control the issue of the money that we use, then what's the solution to that?
Well, I don't think that the full issue is that they control every aspect of the money that we use. I think the problem is that we don't have tight knit communities that are trying to fund very specific initiatives, right? So, like, if you think about the situation in the South, right, there are people who are trying to form community blocks where communities are funding each other, that they're buying from each other, that they're building sustainable housing, food, etc. These are possible models that we could use, but you have other people who are not willing to buy, live, stay in their own communities because, as we know, especially in the South, those are usually rural or very poor, areas. So I don't think it's all the corporatism and the dislocation of money through credit that's killing us. I think the issue is we have not built up resources economically in our own base to be able to confront what's going on now. So think of it this way. There's been a lot of attention to the fact that over 300,000 black women have lost federal jobs. Okay. Why is that having such an impact on the black community? Well, it's having such an impact on the black community because we know that most black men tend to work blue collar jobs. So what end up happening is when you lose those white collar jobs and now you have to take up temporary work or you have to take up or you're underemployed, meaning you're working two part-time jobs, for instance, where's that money going? Right? What's the difference in that earning power? Because before we had arguments saying, well, black people shouldn't get married because people are marrying down. So we didn't have households that could absorb wealth. They weren't working together on that basis. Now that money, that those job opportunities are gone, and we don't have households that can sustain communities, much less neighborhoods, etc., we're in a predicament. So what I'm saying is that if we're going to think economically about this, then we should actually probably talk to people like Darity about, well, what's the best way for us to accumulate wealth given these kind of regional differences and problems that we have, and that we've lost a whole sector of employment, for black women, and they're approaching the same kind of ends as black men. Like we have educated people that can figure out this problem. We're just not listening or trying to figure out the problem because we're not interested in black people figuring it out for themselves. We're still trying to go political routes where nobody's listening to us.
How do we move from this almost, it almost feels like black people politically and socially are adrift now, where, like you said earlier, a lot of the cohesion that we used to have when it came to talking about like a community and talking about how do we move politically, how do we move economically, a lot of that's been dissipated by, as you said, liberal politics, or even by the idea of intersectionality that basically neuters any sort of like black centered progress. Is there a way out of that?
I mean, yeah. I mean, look, man, races survive, right? Like, that's what I'm saying. Like, I'm trying to give a realistic diagnosis of what's going on. I mean, races survive. People will change, but there's a tremendous loss in that, right? You have to think about it, right? There was a period of time where black people didn't think that there were anything but slaves. They literally thought that God had intended for them to be slaves. And then you had people like David Walker, people like Robert Alexander Young, and the ideas changed because they were suffering. They got tired of suffering. The same thing with Jim Crow, and they got tired of suffering. Right? Black people will get tired again. There will be another civil rights movement in the 21st century. And then when they feel they make progress, they'll forget again. And the reason, and here's what's funny. The reason that we forgot is because you had groups of people demonizing what every other group of people in the world thrive off, which is some ethnocentrism or some form of nationalism. So black people will naturally become more nationalistic or ethnocentric, whatever word you want to term it. And the more they suffer, it is an inevitable consequence of what happens to groups of people when they are facing systematic oppression. They will come together. But the cost of that happening and the time that it will take for that to happen is what's the problem. That may not happen for another 20 years. It may not happen for 30. It depends on how we absorb the losses and the deaths, murders, and poverty that our people are literally being pushed into. Now, if you get another Republican president and they continue this Project 2025 or whatever it's called, this kind of stuff, it may happen a lot quicker. But the problem is if you get a Democratic president, you're going to have that splinter again, and you're going to have people say, oh, things will get better. And it really won't, because now everything's down to the states. Like federalism, it's the same thing like when they were trying to, change voting laws, right? The states have a tremendous amount of power to rule their own way because of federalism. So it's the same process, right? It's just black people will suffer because of this. Black people will start to question different theories and ideas and statements that people have because of this. We've seen two failed political movements. We've seen the civil rights movement fail, which was supposed to be the promise of the 80s when I was born in 79, and we saw BLM fail tremendously. It's unbelievable how bad that was. So that tells young people something, that they need a new way of thinking. And in the next decade, people will be more open to other kinds of theories and thoughts. Nothing lasts forever. The problem is in your lifetime, what amount of tyranny, violence, and loss are you willing to endure to get to the next stage of it? That's just a lesson of history.
All right. Um, I'm getting ready to start winding this down, so I want to leave the space with one question for you, the one I usually always ask when we have these conversations. If you had to pick a way out of this, if you had to pick a way, if you had to choose a way or formulate a way to move the idea of the black man body being this sort of amorphous boogeyman or being repository for all the sins of America and being a scapegoat, how would you do that?
How would I do that? I mean, unless I have a magic wand, I would just try to show black people that in America that we're in an active state of war and conflict, right? And that this is part and parcel. This is why I think the work of of Tony and Myron is really important, right? It's a really important component to this because we have to start analyzing why ideology operates to make people believe that groups of people that have fought for liberation since the beginning of time are somehow now the enemies, are enemy number one of your people. I think that we have to confront reality. And that means understanding why black men are killed, why black men are demonized, and then actually leaning into that. Understanding that your oppressor is not going to create positive images of the group of people that it thinks has the most potential to destroy the system or confront a realistic militaristic challenge to it. And that's where we are. I mean, that's why they were afraid of King. That's why they were afraid of X. It's not about the violence. It's not about who could hold the most guns. What the society fears is the instability because white people don't even trust all other white people. So when you had the Vietnam War and those hippies and those yippies and all those other people that were looking at black people and saying that's a model for our revolution, that's a model for our social movement. Black
Yeah.
people inspire social movements to disrupt other things. That's the
Well, underground
power of it.
SDS, yeah, well, underground SDS and the hippies that you mentioned, all of them took their influence from the Panthers and other people
Exactly.
like Detroit.
Exactly. That's the threat. And until black people start loving black people enough to defend the humanity of other black people, even if they disagree with them, until we learn to understand that these kind of momentary civil rights gains were just that momentary, right? Until we understand that, I mean, deeply understand that, then there's not going to be any progress. And until we're not, black people are the best keepsakers of each other, right? White liberals are never going to love black people the way black people love each other. And as I said, this is something that I've seen in Europe. I've seen groups of people care about their group more than other groups of people, and their society seems to do fine. So I'm always curious now, since I've been out here for almost 7 years. I'm curious to understand why we preach against black unity, black solidarity, and black nationalism in America when practically every other EU country that's making money and profiting off enslavement and colonialism lives by that very model. So I guess it remains a question.
All right. One last question before we start winding it down. Um, what do we do about the black managerial class? Because even in the midst of all this horror from 1865 up until the present day, there's always been a managerial class that's kind of been the buffer between the rage of the poor working class and the retribution that probably the people who created this system need to deal with. How are they going to be dealt with, or how are they going to be handle in a situation like this if you're trying to move people who are with had their backs against the wall and they're tired, as you said, that might be coming in the next 20 years? What happens with them?
Yeah, they either disappear or they become absorbed by, you know, the ruling white class. I mean, there've always been, ruling class blacks that are willing to betray their own people for money or for security. I think they're dealt with by the like oppressors. I mean, there's not a whole lot of options here. Right? Like we're not confronting a political situation with a whole bunch of options where the moral conscience of your oppressors have already told you that they're not acting and they're gonna endure the tyranny of the white conservative majority. So in that world, if other black people or the black managerial class continues to support the conservatives and try to make deals with them or remain quiet about the murders of black people, then black people have to either destroy them or override them. And that's what's up in the air, right? We have to we have to disabuse ourselves of the idea that political change in America will always be peaceful because it's never been peaceful. We've always been the casualties of it. And black men and boys have disproportionately been the casualties of it. And we could lie, and we could read poetry, or we could read short stories, or come up with any kind of psychoanalytic justification to get out of that. But that's the reality. Because when we look at the numbers, that's what we see. When we look at the deaths, that's what we see. So until we're willing to stand up about the humanity of black men and boys as the precursor for the whole black community, given the violence that's been imposed on all of us, then we will continue to fail. And you will see increased rise in black people migrating to Canada, to South America, to Vietnam, etc., which is what you're seeing right now. Right? These are lessons of political economy and history. We can change them, but it's a very painful process that we have to go through because we've been lured into this kind of safety net of dependency that doesn't serve any ends or aims for our people.
All right, and I think that's where we'll put a pin in it tonight. I want to thank Dr. Tommy J. Curry for taking time out of his busy schedule to be able to have another episode of the Black Male Study Sessions. Dr. Curry, what are you working on that's coming up that people need to know about?
Trying to finish up these two books, Myth Maketh Man, which is going to be an introduction to black male studies. I'm working on a book on the absence of man or the crisis of kind for Seagull Press. That's really looking at where black people are right now in the United States and how we need to start thinking about what we're losing by claiming that we're actually a success story in a white supremacist democracy. And of course, I'm working on the sequel to The Man Not. So trying to finish up a few research projects.
All right. Well, thanks again for taking time out of your schedule to have this conversation. For everybody who's listening, this has been the Black Male Study Session, episode 5, Lynching Boogeyman. I'm going to put the replay up on YouTube probably Friday. And also, you can go to Substack by the AMHIS, the African American Men's Historical Society. That should all be up by Friday, and it'll be annotated with timestamps so you can go back and pull reference information. And then I think we'll close it out here. Thank you so much, Dr. Curry. Thank you for
Thank you.
everybody who came through and listening. And everybody have a good evening. Y'all be safe.